to the 9th of May 2023. The President has received a message from the House of Representatives informing the Senate of the appointment of Mr Chester to the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. That being the extent of the messages from the House, I'll call the clerk to call on business. Clerk.
Business of the Senate, notice of motion number 2, standing in the name of Senator Roberts, relating to a reference to the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade References Committee.
I call Senator Roberts.
Thank you. I seek leave to amend Business of the Senate notice of motion number 2 relating to a referral to the Foreign Affairs and Defence and Trade References Committee.
Is leave granted? Leave is granted.
Thank you. I amend the motion as set out on the revised amendment circulated in the chamber.
Senator Roberts, you may now speak to the motion.
I move the motion as amended. As a servant of the many different people who make up our one Queensland community, I want to read out the amended motion because I want the provisions in the Hansard. That the following matter be referred to the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade References Committee for inquiry and report by the 1st of December 2020 of time for consideration in detail. The World Health Organization's Pandemic Treaty, also known as the Pandemic Prevention, Preparedness and Response Accord, with reference to the conceptual zero draft of the Pandemic Treaty and any other draft of the Pandemic Treaty. Australia's input to the drafting and negotiating process for the Pandemic Treaty. The principles of Australian economy in responding to health crises and pandemics, the effect of proposals contained in the Pandemic Treaty, and any other related matters. I note that when one of the world's most influential people, someone famous for valuing the liberty and sovereignty of human existence, makes a comment about the risks that United Nations World Health Organization's Pandemic Treaty poses, it's worth listening to. In response to my video of my Senate speech last week criticising the proposed increased health powers of the Pandemic Treaty, Elon Musk said, quote, "Countries should not cede authority to the World Health Organization." End of quote. Regardless of what you think of Elon Musk, he's one of a handful of people invited into the global backrooms of power. He knows better than anyone sitting in this chamber what the world looks like when the press aren't watching. So threatened as a result of this comment was the Director General of the World Health Organization, Tedros Ghebreyesus, that he felt the need to reply to this tweet. Perhaps 4 million impressions and 1.2 million plays of my speech got his attention. Tedros is a man that no sensible Australian would want anywhere near the health response of this nation, not least because of his prominent role as a terrorist in a violent Marxist political party with a track record of using healthcare as a political weapon. In his reply to my speech in this chamber 3 weeks ago, Tedros failed to address the key point that I was making. That key point is that 83 World Health Organization staff were found to have committed rape and sexual exploitation of women in the Congo, some women as young as 13. Who made that finding? The World Health Organization's own investigators. Those investigators went on to say that UN, WHO must take any action against their staff. If they failed to take any action against their staff, it meant that the World Health Organization was rotten with rapists, quote, rotten with rapists. Tedros deliberately ignored that of my speech, so I can only assume those rapists will remain employed in the UN World Health Organization and free to commit further crimes. The World Health Organization really is rotting from the head. Tedros only replied on the issue of sovereignty, which I briefly mentioned. So now let's discuss that in detail, sovereignty. Tedros insists that countries aren't ceding sovereignty to the World Health Organization and that the Pandemic Treaty won't change the sovereignty of member states. It is, he promises, simply a device to help countries better guard against pandemics. Oh, really? And yet the United Nations World Health Organization's advice already achieves that. So why go to all this trouble of a 3-year development cycle for a treaty that doesn't change anything? Here's the case that suggests Tedros is deliberately misleading the public about what the World Health Organization are doing. Remember, this is out in the open. All these documents statements are available on the World Health Organization website. The zero draft, they had to come up with a new number because the first draft was an embarrassment. The zero draft of the treaty clearly shows this is not an agreement about passive advice. The pandemic treaty, despite Tedros's lies on Twitter, proposes to hold the same authority as all other United Nations treaties. It is a set of instructions that nations, corporations, and individuals scripted. People and organisations who have their own interests at heart, not the health, safety, and welfare of the Australian people. Included in the pandemic treaty are the powers to enforce mandatory detention, compulsory vaccination, lockdowns, forced medical procedures, vaccine passports, vaccines really, closed borders, and generally all the worst parts of the global gross COVID deceit and mismanagement. Australia could be locked down without public consent, no mechanism to remand of the fund. Every country is different. Bespoke solutions are essential. The World Health Organization cannot maintain 195 bespoke solutions. It will take the bureaucrats' easy way out, one size fits all. The World Health Organization did not offer the best solution to COVID. Arguably, that was Sweden, and with their business as usual approach. Several Indian states went their own way, which is now offering rich data around vaccination and herd immunity. If we had an all-powerful Tedros pandemic treaty in place at that time, Sweden and India would have had to comply, and the world would not be able to have that information we now have about what worked and what did not work. Perhaps that's the point. If the World Health Organization can require the whole world to follow the same response, how will we know whether the response was the wrong one? We won't know. The United Nations World Health Organization loves to hide the truth. The World Health Organization has a proven record of hiding truth. As it stands, the only reason that a mob of unelected health bureaucrats based in Geneva is not governing Australia is thanks to a collection of African nations who voted down the first version of the pandemic treaty presented as regulation changes last December. This will not happen again. The 42-member African nations bloc has been offered money, technology, bribes, and resources in exchange for their support. Western nations, including Australia, are actually being sent the bill for this bribing of African nations to the tune of billions of dollars. Australian taxpayer paying bribes. We won't have it. This is how much Western money Africa has been offered to support the pandemic treaty. How many understand that this treaty is not just about pandemic management? It's a permanent system of healthcare aid to the third world. The pandemic treaty proposes allowing health stakeholders, such as vaccine companies, to sit as voting members to the World Health Organization committee that would run a pandemic response, with the United Nations World Health Organization declaring potential pandemics. They don't even have to declare a pandemic, just a potential pandemic. Vaccine companies will have the power to order the use of their vaccines around the world under World Health Organization orders. These would include companies like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who are the UN World Health Organization's second largest donor. In return, the World Health Organization promote vaccines from pharmaceutical companies that Bill and Melinda Gates own. The Gates Foundation returns the profit from vaccine purchases to an organization that promotes vaccine use. It's a nice circle. Welcome to cronyism and corruption, World Health Organization style, Gates style, Big Pharma style. In the detail, the World Health Organization has decreed this policy instrument makes the WHO the directing and coordinating authority on global health and the leader of multilateral cooperation in global health governance. It further insists that it will have powers to control the health response from a global to a regional, national, and community level, meaning the World Health Organization, the crooked, corrupt, incompetent, dishonest organization, will have powers inside every Australian town, every suburb, every GP surgery, every state, and every federal health bureaucrat's desk. That would leave little room to doubt the intention of this document is to invade the domestic health processes of each country, right down to the local community health centre. Who will really exercise these powers? I'll tell you. The document clearly states that national sovereignty ends where the impact on other countries begins, at which point the United Nations World Health Organization takes over. Who determines what impacts on another country? The World Health Organization, apparently, setting themselves up as judge, jury, and executioner, with the only right of appeal being the World Health Organization itself. We should ask ourselves, if the World Health Organization declared Sweden to be causing harm during the last pandemic to perhaps neighbouring countries, what action would Tedros and the World Health Organization have taken against them? No one has given an answer to this. Indeed, no one is even curious about these hypothetical powers, extreme hypothetical powers, or what they would look like in even the most basic real-world scenario. The use of the SWIFT system to process international transactions, financial transactions, were used to enforce sanctions against Russia. This is the most likely method of delivering World Health Organization sanctions, and it has been mooted. The treaty will create a monstrous health bureaucracy that binds Australia to funding the health systems of developing nations, even though we can't seem to find the money to build hospitals in our own country. Only today, reports in the media of mothers-to-be in Gladstone, Queensland, having to travel hours to get to a maternity centre. Gladstone is a city of 35,000 people. It's not a village, and has a maternity unit that is effectively closed to new deliveries. This is a first world country, or was. Perhaps if the treaty comes in, Premier Palaszczuk can apply to the World Health Organization to pay for a new birthing unit. That's sarcasm, by the way. I'd never want them to build any damn thing. Our states have some of the worst health records in half a century, and yet we cannot wait to rush in as global saviours of international health and throw what little money we have left behind the World Health Organization. The zero draft of the WHO pandemic treaty, accord or instrument, whatever the rebranding is made, must be referred for a detailed review, including the costing. We need to know exactly what the price tag is going to look like. We need to know exactly how much sovereignty will be ceded to an international body that has proven itself to be politically compromised to China, a nation offering sufficient security concerns that our defence minister decided we need to sign AUKUS to provide, in part, protection against China. Under the pandemic treaty, the private medical data of citizens becomes the property of global health bureaucrats and their corporate stakeholders. Your private health data becomes their property. Will this data be de-identified? Not on the current wording, it won't. Our citizens, we all in this country, become vulnerable to foreign health rules, procedures and orders, dictates from bureaucrats that Australia cannot even vote out of power, from whom we cannot even protect ourselves. Nor can we hold these bastards accountable. Unlimited power, unending unlimited power. The pandemic treaty will ensure that nations like Australia, who are the least likely to be the cause of a global pandemic, are required to bear an unfair burden of cost for the mistakes of other regimes. The pandemic treaty is a political document, not a health document, and must be treated as such. The treaty dictates how much money Australian governments must spend on pandemic prevention. 5% of annual health budgets. It cedes sovereignty to unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats in Geneva and New York. It requires Australia to give away a defined percentage of our GDP on international cooperation and assistance on pandemic prevention. Give away a defined percentage of our GDP. It cedes sovereignty to unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats in Geneva and New York. Under our Constitution's external affairs powers, the Commonwealth Government is empowered to sign away our sovereignty and require the state to make this expenditure. The external affairs powers are being used here in a manner our founding fathers did not envisage. What about the other UN agencies? I imagine they're all eyeing this one off. What a way to extend their power and their funding, their control. Since when did Australia's governments allow the UN World Health Organization to make binding demands on public money and the allocation of funds? One nation completely opposes the UN World Health Organization being issued with a magic credit card with Australian taxpayers paying the bill. And what of reviewing the severe risk a unified health response places on national security? Do we want potentially hostile nations knowing exactly how Australia will respond to a pandemic, given that pandemic might come in the form of a biological weapon? Because that is what the pandemic treaty demands. Signing this is a violation of national security. We can't wait until the treaty is completed and the passing through Parliament a fait accompli, as every other sovereignty sapping agreement has done. We can't wait until then. We have to hit this now. This is far too important. People's lives are at stake. People's health is at stake. Our nation's sovereignty is at stake. Our negotiating committee, permanently based in Zurich, needs to receive their instructions from the Australian people, not from the pharmaceutical establishment. At the very least, the pandemic treaty must be submitted for a rigorous, detailed and forensic review to determine exactly what we are agreeing to. This must happen now so the negotiating body understands what the public will accept and what it will not accept. After which, the public must be allowed to decide if it is prepared to cede control of healthcare, something that has always been proudly under the control of Australia if it wants to cede that instead to the international bureaucracy. It's a question so significant that it's worthy of a plebiscite. Yet the best we can do is to come into the Senate chamber and beg for a Senate inquiry. This treaty needs an inquiry now to help our negotiators make good decisions, decisions in the national interest, decisions everyday Australians struggling with an out-of-control cost of living can afford. I want to make a point that Senator Alex Antic, Senator Pauline Hanson, Senator Ralph Babet are co-sponsors, co-movers of this motion. This work on the United Nations started in my very first speech in the Senate in 2016. It continued thoroughly, completely, continually until now, and it will continue because the United Nations and the World Health Organization are corrupt, dishonest, disgraceful entities, inhuman entities. And I will not shut up on this until we are exiting from the United Nations. I call on an Oz exit. After years of Liberal, Labor, Greens gutlessly ceding sovereignty over many aspects of this country, we will chase and hold accountable governments on this, just like we did on the cash ban and won on that. So thank you very much, Madam Acting Deputy President.
Thank you, Senator Roberts. And before I call you, Senator Babet, I will just remind senators to be diligent in their use of parliamentary language during these debates. Senator Babet.
Thank you. And I thank Senator Malcolm Roberts for this motion, and I rise here in this place today to support the motion. I too spoke about the ever-encroaching United Nations, WHO, and all their sister organisations in my maiden speech. Now, during the 2020 election campaign, the UAP took to the people of Australia a serious concern. It went well, a serious concern. That concern, of course, was the ever-encroaching power of the WHO, the ever-growing power of the WHO. Specifically, we sounded the alarm on the pandemic treaty. We did our best to get our warning out to the public. We allocated significant resources into an education campaign around the proposed treaty, which was swiftly dismissed by the majority of people here in this place and by the legacy media as just another conspiracy theory, just more misinformation, even though our nation was already heavily entangled in the early stages of this treaty via the Intergovernmental Negotiating Body. Just another conspiracy theory, they said. Well, it's now unfolding right before our very eyes. Not a conspiracy theory anymore, is it? Now, it is up to us in this place to ensure that our nation's interests are protected from any agreement which could impact the autonomy of our people and, of course, our nation, our sovereignty. It must be protected. In the past 3 years, what's it taught us? I'll tell you what it's taught us. It's taught us that secrecy and lack of disclosure erode trust, and it produces poor outcomes. Like I keep talking about here in this place over and over again, we need transparency. Now, the Australian people, they were shielded from the truth when they voted in 2022, and we must do all that we can to ensure that no treaty is signed off until the people have their chance to look at the issue and properly dissect and understand the implications. What have we learned from the pandemic? What have we learned? We've learned that transparency and accountability is the best way forward. That's what we've learned from that. Even Elon Musk tweeted just last week in response to Senator Roberts, as Senator Roberts mentioned, and I'll quote again for the Hansard, countries should not cede authority to the WHO. They should not. I asked all of you here one question. Who should control or guide our government response to the next health emergency? Should it be the WHO, an unelected international body with no accountability, or should it be the Australian people? Should it be us, democratically elected here in this place to serve the people? As a rhetorical question, of course, it should be us. The Department of Health and Aged Care website states, and I quote, I'll quote,
Order.
once the new instrument has been finalised, the Australian government will make a decision on whether to agree to it. And changes to the international health regulations may create a new international legal obligation for Australia. Now, I urge everyone here in this place to consider the second statement carefully. We must understand what the WHO wants to achieve, and we must ask our constituents, we must ask them if they are comfortable letting a foreign, unelected bureaucracy potentially take the wheel next time there is a public health emergency. Now, I was elected to this place because the people of Victoria disapproved of the last pandemic response. Never again can we allow basic, inalienable human rights to be tossed to the side. Never again can we threaten livelihoods, close borders, grant indemnity to big pharma, or break up families.
Hear, hear.
We must learn from our mistakes and not offload our responsibility to unaccountable and, in my opinion, easily corruptible foreign bodies. Some examples, I'll give them to you. Bill Gates was the second highest donor to the WHO in 2020-2021, the start of the pandemic. Greater even than the United States, Germany was the highest with US 751 million donated. In addition to this, the Global Vaccine Alliance, which Bill Gates created in 1999, has done 1.5 billion US dollars from 2016 to 2020. They've also donated $452 million to the WHO in 2020-2021. So basically, foundations supported or funded by Bill Gates have donated in total over $1 billion US dollars to the WHO in 2020-21. Gates said in 2010 in the now infamous TED Talk that if we do a good job on vaccines, we can reduce the world's population by 1.5 billion or so. Now, I'll be clear, and I will say that that comment may have been taken out of context, but it makes you wonder. It makes you wonder, is he all about promoting vaccines no matter what the cost? That he makes, vaccines that he makes. Thank you, Senator Roberts. Now, Gates is also quoted as saying, and this is what he has said, he gets a 20-to-1 return on any investment he makes on vaccines. Doesn't that make you wonder what he's up to? The guy who funds the WHO, isn't that enough to make you say, hang on a sec, maybe we should look at this? Yeah. Now, I, for one, I am opposed to the WHO pandemic treaty, and millions of Australians stand with me. Now, just like the lyrics to that famous song from the band The Who, I'll get on my knees and pray that we don't get fooled again. Thank you.
Senator Rennick. Oh, sorry,
Thank you,
sorry,
Acting.
Senator Rennick. Senator Brown was on her feet.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, Senator Rennick. I did see Senator Brown first. I thought she was calling a point of order, but I will give the call to Senator Brown. Thank you, Senator Brown.
You're so kind, Senator Rennick. The devastating effects of COVID-19 pandemic has been felt across the world, including here in Australia. Countries from across the globe are looking to determine how the global health system could better work in future pandemics so that they can better protect their populations, minimise economic effects, and see a more effective and equitable global response. This Parliament has a long established since 1996 and a significant role in scrutinising treaties prior to binding treaty action being taken by government, led by the Joint Standing Committees on Treaties, JSCOT. Before Australia can ratify any new international agreement, once negotiated, the JSCOT will consider the agreement, undertake further consultation with stakeholders and members of the public, and make a recommendation to Parliament as to whether Australia should ratify the agreement. The proposed new instrument on pandemic prevention, preparedness and response is still being negotiated, and key provisions have not been agreed between countries. There is not yet a final agreement for the Parliament to consider. Negotiations on a new instrument are not expected to be concluded until May 2024 at the earliest. We therefore oppose the proposed motion. And let me also take this opportunity to clarify a range of misunderstandings about this proposed instrument. Countries retain sovereignty regarding their public health policies, including public health and safety measures such as border measures, use of masks and vaccines. This is enshrined in the very first paragraph of the current draft agreement, which enforces the principle that each country retains responsibility and control of its own health policies. It is also enshrined in international law, including the existing International Health Regulations 2005. The WHO has no legal authority to force countries to accept any recommendations. The WHO can only provide assistance at the request of a country. Australian law can only be changed by an act of Parliament, not by an international treaty or any other international legal instrument. No international instrument can change or affect Australia's constitution. Any changes to Australian law to implement the new instrument would also have to be considered and passed by Parliament through the usual processes. Negotiations are currently underway on the new instrument and nothing has been agreed. In particular, the specific proposals referred to in the motion will be subject to extensive negotiation by member states and have not been agreed. The specific proposals referred to in points B and D are not being considered for inclusion in the new instrument. While this instrument is being negotiated through the mechanisms of the WHO, negotiations are between countries only. This is an opportunity to pursue Australia's objectives for improvement to global health systems, which include strengthening the international community's efforts to prevent and respond to future pandemics, allowing Australia to pursue international and regional health priorities while protecting domestic interests and sovereign rights, protecting the Australian community's health and well-being against the threat of future. Further information on the and on the WHO. Government expect to commence public consultation on the proposed instrument later in the year, once the likely shape of the agreement is better defined. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Rennick.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. And I rise today to speak in support of this motion because this motion goes to the essence of democracy. It goes to what our forefathers have fought for the last 250 years. And I hark back to that great year, 1776, when the great patriots of the USA fought against the foreign oppression. And I know many of you on the other side like to laugh at that, but that was the flame that lit the light of democracy. And that was followed up with the French Revolution. And what makes Western civilization so great is that it is founded on grassroots movements, not unelected elite bureaucrats out there in Switzerland who make these decisions and then use globally controlled media to influence decisions. So while I agree with you, Senator Brown, on the fact that I don't think that we are going to give up our sovereignty to the WHO in terms of what's binding and non-binding, I do think that we do risk being influenced by the so-called vibe. And we saw that in the COVID pandemic, where we would religiously follow the orders or the proclamations from the WHO without any questioning. And we had great big organisations called, big organisations under the umbrella of the Trusted News Initiative giving these commands, and you weren't allowed to actually question anything. You weren't allowed to actually question anything. And if you did, you were censored. And we've seen that come out recently with the Twitter files, where the White House, for example, was influencing social media companies, and anyone that tried to put a story out there about, might have questioned the safety of the vaccines was immediately barred from social media, and that is not right. And that was a globally coordinated effort. Now, there were no laws in place to say that any of that was legal, but what was in place was a system of influence that's been brought about by the centralised control of wealth. And I just want to give a bit of a prologue here in this country. I know as I grew up, my first memory of politics was in 1983 when Bob Hawke was elected. And within months of him being elected, he went off to the High Court in order to overthrow a state government that wanted to build a dam. Now, put aside the environmental issues of the Franklin Dam, the fact of the matter is that the Labor Party used the Constitution to argue that foreign treaties ought to override states' powers. And that undermined democracy. It undermined our own Constitution. Okay? You can't tell me when Deakin and Barton, the two great protectionists of this party, the first two prime ministers of this country, when they helped formulate the Constitution, that when they said that the federal government should have powers over foreign powers, that meant that foreign treaties could override domestic law. And that's exactly what the Franklin Dam decision did. And it was the start of unwinding our sovereignty in this country. 1985, Paul Keating let foreign banks into this country without any capital controls. And that mattered because for the next 30 years, we saw go out on a borrowing spree. We went from 8 billion, they had 8 billion in debt in 1985 to 800 billion debt in 2007. And all of that money went into housing. There were no controls over how much went into manufacturing or industry. And if it had my way, for every dollar that we borrow offshore for housing, another dollar has to go into industry. We have to cap down on this foreign debt because it is another form of influence. Then we had the Button Plan, which ultimately destroyed manufacturing in this country. It destroyed the great state of Victoria, and that was followed up by the Dawkins Plan, which then brought in and empowered universities. So we've basically got rid of our manufacturing industry and we've replaced it and empowered it with these Marxists in universities that go around and undermine the working population. And to cap it all off then, we had superannuation, which basically funded the sale of our infrastructure to unelected officials in superannuation along with foreign ownership. And that superannuation has centralised all the battlers' wealth in this country so that we've got now, for example, the industry funds, they use one proxy manager. They own over 20% of all the major top 50 companies in Australia, and they vote together with that one proxy vote. And what's happened in Australia has also happened overseas. We have wealth managers like BlackRock, Vanguard, who have controlling interests in NBC, controlling interests in Pfizer. These people, the people that sit on the boards, they also sit on the NIH, and there's massive conflicts of interest. And that is where we get the problem with these treaties. Because with the World Health Organization, and as Senator Roberts rightly pointed out before, Bill Gates, I think, and I'll stand to be corrected on this, is a massive donor to the World Health Organization. I think he might be the second biggest donor. He has enormous influence. He's not accountable to anyone. He himself has backflipped on how effective the vaccines were. But yet again, there is no level of accountability. And that is the problem with organisations like the World Health Organization. And look, you know, I think that they served a purpose after World War II. I think that the United Nations was created with the good intentions of trying to resolve, find a peaceful solution between countries going to war. But of course, as we know with the famous Victoria Newell and Geoffrey Peart leaked conversation there back in 2014, Ban Ki-moon actually condoned the overthrow of a democratically elected government in Ukraine. So you've got to ask yourself, why not on a strive for peace? The difference. I've got no problems with seeking cooperation between countries. That is very important. We do not want conflicts going on. But at the same time, we have to respect a nation's sovereignty. And that means that the people and the government must listen to its people. And this is particularly relevant because Section 477(1)(c) of the Biosecurity Act actually empowers the Health Minister to declare an emergency on a recommendation by the World Health Organization. Now, that is actually already in legislation. And that is very, very scary, the fact that we have already legislated the fact that the health minister can make a unilateral decision based on the recommendation of the World Health Organization. And that is why this inquiry is so important, because we need to shine a light on the actual dealings of the bureaucrats. And let's face it, it's the bureaucrats. I've often said this, it's the bureaucrats who are a shadow government, in this country. It's not us. We turn up here 19 weeks of the year and we just run across the chamber to the bells like, monkeys on a tin can or whatever. No, it's the bureaucrats who have permanent jobs. They get to go on the junkets over to Switzerland. Occasionally, the other side might get to go. And I think I picked up before that there's actually permanent bureaucrats that live in Switzerland doing the deals. So you can imagine how much influence, how easily influenced they're going to be by their colleagues in Switzerland when they're going out whining and dining and, doing after schnapps on the slopes after a day down the slopes, and I must admit maybe I should try and jag a job thinking about it like that. I mean, what a cushy job that would be. But the point is you can imagine just how, easy it would be influenced for these bureaucrats to be influenced by these people that the people in Australia would never even know. We see, so much money was spent throughout COVID. We saw the World Health Organization flip-flop. They flip-flopped on masks. They flip-flopped on remdesivir. And you have to ask yourself, why did they flip-flop? Was it political pressure? Was it the wheelings and dealings of, for example, these wealthy fund managers like BlackRock, Vanguard, the Gateses of the world who had conflicts of interest trying to push their drugs onto people when they weren't properly tested? So I can think that it's a fantastic idea that we do shine a light on the wheelings and dealings of these treaties. I ask everyone to support this motion.
Senator Cox.
Thank you. I rise to speak to this motion, and the Greens will be opposing this motion. And the attempt to undermine the World Health Organization, the claim that they undermine Australia's sovereignty. And I think I'm pretty well positioned to talk about sovereignty in this place. The World Health Assembly has decided to create a treaty for prevention, preparedness and response. And this decision was actually made by consensus. The Greens support this decision, and the World Health Organization represents governments from across the world, all of which have had vastly different experiences of COVID-19's pandemic. Even within Australia, we've had vastly different experiences of the pandemic. I know that my experience as a West Australian is very different from people in New South Wales or Victoria. And this treaty will gather their learnings, and the WHO will draft and negotiate the WHO Convention, Agreement and other international instruments on pandemic prevention, preparedness and response. This is actually a good thing because it's important that we learn from the responses of governments right across the world so we can do better next time. Australia needs a plan. We are now the only country in the OECD that does not have a national authority on communicable and their control. The Australian Greens plan for pandemic preparedness in Australia includes establishing a National Centre for Disease Control with $246 million of funding to lead a unified apolitical health approach across the entire country and to ensure that we can deal with the threat of new and emerging diseases. Investing $250 million over the next 2 years into COVID-19 vaccine research and ensuring that we can produce enough of our own vaccines onshore for everybody by building, operating publicly owned mRNA vaccine production facilities. Using a boosted foreign aid budget to invest in COVAX to support globally equitable vaccine access. All of these play a critical role in ensuring that Australia is as prepared as possible for the next pandemic. I want to turn to how First Nations communities were impacted by COVID-19. And to put it simply, without those lockdowns, which we all absolutely detested, especially in some of our remote communities, COVID-19 could have been absolutely devastating. These lockdowns actually saved lives. These lockdowns helped keep COVID-19 out of already vulnerable communities. And I remember before becoming a senator, I was working alongside some of those remote communities in Western Australia who actually moved boulders onto access roads to stop people coming in and spreading COVID-19. Some of these communities don't have access to clean running water and may not have access to healthcare to treat them if they in fact did get sick from COVID-19. And indeed, we know that First Nations people have significantly worse health outcomes than non-First Nations people. The life expectancy in Australia is 83.2 years. We are number 8 in the world in this regard. For the comparison is one life expectancy of 85.3. So just to put that into context, for a First Nations person here in Australia, our average life expectancy is 71.6 years for men and 75.6 years for women. So in fact, I don't have that long to go, about 30 years. It's also been found that the burden of diseases may result in illness but not death, such as mental illness, injuries, arthritis, hearing loss, asthma, which have all had a huge impact on other diseases because of your immune system was already compromised, especially for First Nations people and in their communities. We saw all through this pandemic, if someone had an underlying condition, they were more likely to become sicker and perhaps have a harder time to recover from COVID-19. First Nations people are getting sicker earlier and for longer. And in fact, what those statistics tell us is that we are in fact dying earlier. This is still a reality for our community and for Australia as a whole. And it is the result of ongoing oppression that's been going since colonisation in this country. We are already worse off, and if COVID-19 was allowed to run rampant in our communities, this would be catastrophic. We've seen some progress being made, but as we debated the most recent Closing the Gap in the first sitting period in March, we know that this is not happening fast enough. 4 out of the 18 targets are on track, only 4. And this in itself is disgusting and disgraceful. The other 14 are either not on track or there's no new data, so we don't even know how we're tracking. And that in itself is a huge problem which needs to be addressed. First Nations people, good health is more than just the absence of disease or illness. It's a holistic concept, and that includes physical, social, emotional, cultural and spiritual well-being, both for an individual but also for their communities. That's why it's so important to have community-led healthcare, because First Nations people understand this. We understand the cultural difference between First Nations health and non-First Nations people's health, and that must be taken into consideration to provide adequate health and well-being care. This is integral into the success of the Closing the Gap initiatives. We need First Nations people deeply embedded in our approaches as we tackle these issues, from housing to healthcare to education to incarceration. This is not enough to be in consultation with First Nations people. The solutions need to be First Nations created, led and managed. So one element of the pandemic preparedness is to ensure remote communities have access both to clean water and community-led healthcare. And it is making progress in all of the aspects of Closing the Gap, because the healthier our communities are, the better off we will be able to face the next pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Antic.
Thank you. Australia as a sovereign nation has the right to exercise its own judgments and its decisions when it comes to dealing with healthcare issues and emergencies. And power consolidated in the hands of a few, especially when those few are an international elite, establishes a precedent of subordinating to global issues like the Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, we witnessed Australia's CHOs, Chief Health Officers, Premiers obediently defer to the advice of the World Health Organization, which pushed for the hardest possible restrictions, including lockdowns, border closures, mask mandates, vaccine mandates, and so on, and all without concern for the damage that would be done to those upon whose advice they were relying. And much of this advice was not only wrong, but it was also dangerous. And I'm speaking of the advice specifically there in relation to lockdowns and mandates. But this didn't prevent the WHO Director Tedros from telling the world in early 2020 that, and I quote, "One of the greatest dangers we now face is complacency, and there must be a new normal." Well, when millions of people are locked in their homes, Tedros said, once again quoting, "The same public health measures that we've been advocating since the beginning of the pandemic must remain the backbone of the response in all countries. Find every case, isolate every case, test every case, care for every case, trace and quarantine every contact." It's hard to believe in hindsight, but that's what was being said. Anyone who pointed out basic facts was deemed a conspiracy theorist by the WHO, and they encouraged the actions I just described, which trampled the most basic rights, liberties and dignity of Australian citizens and citizens throughout the world. Such rights included rights to freedom of speech, movement and association. And I say freedom of speech because anyone who defied the WHO's supposedly expert advice, including eminent medical professionals, were censored and vilified by the media and big tech at the behest of government and these organisations, and the only narrative that was allowed oxygen were those parroting the WHO. Many Australian healthcare providers were suspended for contradicting what was ultimately the WHO's position on COVID-19 vaccines. Their predictions and observations have turned out to be correct, and we'll see how that narrative is slowly changing. And we saw it this weekend when, on Saturday, on the front page of the Weekend Australian, the tragic story of Amy Sedgwick was told. And the article explains how a 24-year-old woman's health rapidly deteriorated following her COVID-19 injections, which is thought to have led to her death. Yet the WHO's website to date states, quote, "The vaccine is safe and effective for all individuals aged 6 months. All efforts should be taken to achieve high vaccine coverage rates in the highest and high priority use groups." Well, clearly we have here a contradiction between what is reality and what is actually the official advice of the WHO. And it should be obvious to anyone with a functioning memory, that from the Weekend Australian, or that the story of the Weekend Australian this weekend would have been deemed and considered dangerous and probably even anti-vax by the censorship industrial complex known as the mainstream media in this country, which only a year ago parroted the WHO's dangerous lines. The WHO is slowly drip feeding these stories to normalise the idea that people who pushed against this agenda were wrong. And also that there's no way they could have known at the time. Well, we did know at the time. People did know at the time. Experts did know at the time. And there are thousands of stories out there like the tragic one of Amy Sedgwick and her families. If only people in this place had taken the time to listen to them, and nobody did bar a few. I say that because the rules that Amy Sedgwick followed were precisely the same rules that the WHO sought to have member governments of the WHO enforce. So why then would we even entertain further involving ourselves with this body? Why would we possibly entertain signing and ratifying a treaty to make further encumbrances on our own sovereign nation? In the early days of the pandemic, the WHO refused to investigate the Chinese Communist Party's potential involvement in the development and release of COVID-19, despite the fact that the virus came from China. It was never, ever, ever an issue. Just down the road, we had a major virology institute that had labs in which coronaviruses had been experimented on. And when they finally did start investigating the CCP, they quickly confirmed that there was no wrongdoing on their part. We've all forgotten that, but that's what happened. Coincidentally, the WHO refused to acknowledge the existence of a little country called Taiwan, or, I mean, this is the body we're dealing with. This is the body we're talking about here, the one that's so vaunted by those opposite the chamber. So one might well be excused for being just a tiny bit sceptical about the WHO's supposed independence when it comes to international matters. I believe that government power needs to be at its lowest possible feasible level, and wherever that power is given, it shouldn't be abused by on a supernatural level. And of course, national or federal power is required. The federal government shouldn't be controlling the lives of communities. And this is even more so in the case of international level. And the idea that the WHO should have control over individuals' personal medical choices is an egregious abuse of power. This WHO pandemic treaty represents a further descent into the world of centralised powers that our leaders, our representatives in this place are failing to prevent. And you'll all understand in due course, I assure you of that. Our government departments are walking lockstep with a globalist agenda of the WEF, the UN and the WHO, and we're ceding our national sovereignty bit by bit, death by 1,000 cuts. There's a lot to discuss the proposed treaty, But if you choose just one example, Article 17 deals with the strengthening pandemic and public health literacy, and it reads, quote, "The WHO will conduct regular social listening and analysis to identify the prevalence and profiles of misinformation, which contribute to the design, communications and messaging of strategies for the public to counter misinformation and what else? Disinformation." What's the difference? We'll never know. This is what the document says. Presumably the WHO will define what is deemed to be misinformation and presumably disinformation at some time, and then we'll all know, and even uses the term false news. I'm sure this would be very convenient for the financial contributors to the WHO that are heavily invested in the development and manufacturing of vaccines. And as I stated earlier, much, if not all, of what the WHO considered misinformation ultimately was, guess what? True. Turned out to be true. How about that? Why then would the Australian government entertain a treaty which allows the WHO to define what constitutes misinformation and under the guise of international law, and presumably work with social media companies to further censor the people of Australia and those that take a stand? I mean, that's what design, communications and messaging strategy really means, ultimately. Essentially, the Australian government's lining up to sign an agreement that the WHO is the central body determining how once sovereign nations prepare for and deal with pandemics. We don't need international solidarity. We need to be establishing ourselves as a sovereign nation with our own response and mechanisms in place, and they should strike a balance between public health and safety as a fundamental respect for people's dignity and human rights, as well as being genuine science-based, not genuine science-based. Simply put, the WHO will ensure that the process by which pandemic-related products, which obviously means vaccines, are approved by regulatory agencies, in this case, the TGA, will be even speedier. Apparently, the COVID-19 vaccines were not developed and approved quickly enough despite the lack of long-term safety data of any form. And once again, I can't help but notice how convenient this is to the pharmaceutical investors and manufacturers. The Saturday's Weekend Australian presents an undeniable proof of why this hastening of development of these drugs is dangerous. Australia is being led by blind guides who are not listening to the voices of Australian people or even the dissenting voices of highly qualified experts, but to the voices of international elites whose top priority is not to do what is best for the people of Australia. So I support this motion, I commend it, and my view is get out of the WHO.
Senator Trubridge.
Thank you, Acting Deputy. I rise to speak against this motion, and I want to thank Senator Cox for her contribution and putting the perspective of First Nations communities onto the floor of the Senate when it comes to spreading disinformation about critical public health responses. Because these conspiracy theories from the Cooker Conspiracy Club that occupies the far-right fringes of the Senate chamber, the Cooker Conspiracy Club, actually causes harm in the real world. I don't know what the credentials to get into the Cooker Conspiracy Club are, but they would probably involve some secret handshake and a genuine disgust of science and evidence. I suppose they're the kind of, you have to establish that before you get entry into the club. A sort of dark and miserable 1970s shag pile on the floor of the Cooker Conspiracy Club, a variety of sort of strange antiquarian suits or clothing that they wear. Who knows what it involves? But at the core of it is actually a dangerous disbelief in science, and worse still, a political willingness to play with people's lives and play with public health for a narrow sectional political interest. And it's actually dangerous what they're doing. It's dangerous to public health. It's particularly dangerous to First Nations communities who are especially vulnerable to these public health risks. And it is a reckless abuse of the position, their positions as senators in this place. What the pandemic has highlighted very clearly was a dangerous lack of preparation around the world for pandemics. And when it comes to Australia, it showed how the Commonwealth was not adequately prepared to respond to a global pandemic. And as much as we would want to wish pandemics away or hope that they could be dealt with by putting up, sovereign borders and sealing Australia off from the world, we're in a globally connected world. And if we're going to respond to the threat of a global pandemic, we need to do it in cooperation with the rest of the world. And we need some global strategies to deal with how to deal with a pandemic. And that means we need organisation and resourcing. And to ignore that or pretend otherwise actually exposes our community and the rest of the global population to harm. And they're quite happy to do that. The Cooker Club are quite happy to do that, to expose Australians, particularly vulnerable Australians, those with significant health concerns, older Australians. The Cooker Club is quite happy to expose those vulnerable parts of our community to highly elevated risks from pandemics. They're quite happy to do that because I think they get some sort of narrow political benefit out of it. And we saw, I think, one of them, Victorian senator, step up and say how actually spreading conspiracy theories had been his pathway to getting elected to this Senate. Well, that's a kind of tragic statement, really, that the spreading of conspiracy theories was actually his way of getting elected. And he was quite shameless about it. And the far right fringes of the National Party and the Liberal Party are also giving a safe berth to these same conspiracy theorists, giving the same place to conspiracy theorists because they think there's an electoral advantage in it, a narrow electoral advantage in tearing down public health outcomes, tearing down public confidence in vaccines, which we know have been some of the most significant public health victories for the planet in the last century. They may not like it. They obviously don't like science. They obviously don't care. But vaccines have been some of the most significant public health outcomes, and they're willing, for their narrow political advantage, to tear down public confidence in that. That is almost the definition of venal politics. That's the definition of venal politics right there from that lot. And of course, conspiracy theories are now in vogue in the far right fringes of politics around the world. This is the kind of Trumpian politics they're trying to introduce into Australia. They've never seen an election result they don't agree with, that they haven't wanted to tear down through a conspiracy theory. Tear down through a conspiracy theory. They use conspiracy theories in the United States to produce appalling public policy outcomes, not least of which is targeted voter suppression. So they create a conspiracy about the integrity of the voting system without any factual basis for it, based on one or two anecdotes. And then they weaponize that politically to do targeted voter suppression in the United States. That's the game plan of the Cooker Conspiracy Club. That's what they do in the United States, and they want to bring that game plan here. They do it on anti-vax too, bringing deeply unscientific, non-credible anecdotes to try and tear down public confidence in vaccine efficiencies. And of course, one of the things they want us to do is to repeat their conspiracy theories. Because if we, in meeting these unscientific fringe conspiracy theories, if we repeat their conspiracy theories, it produces what's called the backfire effect. That if we engage in any way in a place like this in the Senate with the details of their myths and their conspiracies, that somehow makes them appear more plausible. They actually want us to repeat the nonsense back at them because that gives their nonsense some kind of credibility. And I think we need to be mindful of not doing that, mindful of not repeating the nonsense conspiracy theory and instead resort to the facts. And the facts are, when it comes to the moves afoot, very sensible moves afoot to get a pandemic treaty. The facts of this. The World Health Organization's Assembly's pandemic treaty is designed, is to establish an intergovernmental negotiating body, which intent is to draft and negotiate a World Health Convention agreement or some other international instrument on pandemic prevention, preparedness and response. The idea is that we cooperate with the rest of the world to come up with a plan for the next pandemic, to prevent it, to be prepared if it hits the planet, if and when it hits the planet, and to have an integrated response to deal with a global pandemic. And they don't want that to happen because they don't care about vulnerable people. They don't care about the elderly. They don't care about people with who have immunodepressed health response. They don't care. They're willing to play with the lives of vulnerable Australians for their own narrow political advantage. and that is kind of obscene outcome. That is a kind of obscene outcome from the Cooker Conspiracy Club in the Senate. And of course, the intent is instrument under a long-standing article of the World Health Organization's constitution. And then, of course, once we have a global treaty framework, it's up to Australia how to implement it. Entirely up to Australia how to implement it. It's up to decisions of the Australian government and our state and territory governments how we implement a World Health Organization treaty. And I know that's awkward for the conspiracy theorists to take on board. But once a treaty is implemented under Australian law, and perhaps they should read the Constitution they say they care about. Perhaps I'd suggest that Senator Renwick doesn't start his lesson in Australian constitutional law in 1776, because he's probably on the wrong continent, but it's up to him. But if Australia looked at high court decisions, they would know that entering into a treaty under Australian law in no way incorporates that into Australian domestic law. It just doesn't. No, that's an awkward constitutional reality for the club. You know, the conspiracy club finds the reality of how our constitution works politically inconvenient because it doesn't work with their scare campaign. But the Constitution is very clear. The High Court has said repeatedly that entering into a treaty, the act of the executive government entering into a treaty, whether it's a World Health Organization treaty or an arms reduction treaty or a treaty on bilateral trade, does not incorporate the treaty into domestic law. Just doesn't. And I suppose, you know, actually understanding the Constitution, some people would think would be a kind of prerequisite for a senator before they get up and sprout their conspiracy theories, but they're not troubled by that. They're not troubled by evidence. They're not troubled by law. They just want to make people feel uncomfortable and uneasy because that's their political, they think there's a political advantage for it. But it does not incorporate a treaty into Australian law. For any element of a treaty to be incorporated into Australian law, this Parliament or a state or territory parliament has to determine to do so by passing a law or granting a power to a minister. The idea that it's entering into a treaty is some sort of surrender of sovereignty is just plain nonsense. And they know it's nonsense, I think, because I actually give them some credit. They know it's nonsense. They know it's false. They know it's a lie, but we still get ridiculous motions like this. They know they're peddling lies to the Australian public. They know they're deliberately creating people to have unease.
Senator Shoeridge, resume your seat. Senator O'Sullivan.
President, interesting debate, but I believe there's a crossing the line in terms of impugning my against other senators.
I was listening to you, Senator Shoebridge, and you might have accused senators of doing something that would have been perhaps unparliamentary. So I would just ask you to consider that and move on with your comments, and I'll be listening carefully. Senator Shoebridge.
Thank you, Deputy President. They don't care. They don't care that the rhetoric they put here is totally contrary to the law, totally contrary to the Constitution. And as I said before, I give them the credit. They know it's wrong. They know what they're saying is wrong, but they don't care, because a really good conspiracy for them doesn't have to be grounded in the truth. Now, I was counting the number of conspiracy theories that Senator Renwick had. It's one of the challenges in trying to follow the senator's contributions, and I got up to 6. And there was somehow superannuation was in it. Somehow the Button Plan was in it. Bill Gates, of course, featured at some point. The UN was in on it. Somehow or other, universities were in on it. Former Minister Dawes was in on it. And I was trying to work out how to weave all the conspiracies together into some coherent whole. And that way danger lies, I think, trying to pretend that they think that there's some sort of coherence in it. They just throw out all these individual elements. They throw out all these individual conspiracies, and they hope that one of them will stick in someone's mind. You know, maybe it was the UN. Maybe it is superannuation. Maybe it all comes down to the Button Plan. Maybe it's the WHO. Maybe it's Bill Gates. You know, maybe it's banks in general. Maybe it's something that happened in Ottawa in 1917. I don't know. But it is never grounded in any kind of coherence or facts. It is the worst abuse of the position of an elected representative to do that.
Is this a point of order, Senator
It
Scarr?
is,
Senator Scarr?
personal reflection and imputation of motive against my friend and colleague, Senator Rennick. Senator Shoebridge was directly speaking about Senator Rennick then, and he talked about abuse, a process, etc. He should withdraw.
Senator Shoebridge, it is appropriate to use people's proper titles, and we will collectively, I think, clarify that it's Senator Rennick. And I just ask you to reflect on the comments that you made in relation to that senator.
Yes. Well, I apologise for calling Senator Rennick anything other than his name.
Senator Shoebridge, resume your seat. Senator Scarr on the point of order.
Acting Deputy President, I specifically raised in my point of order that Senator Shoebridge should withdraw. If you didn't have an opportunity to hear the comments, then perhaps you want to take on notice, review the Hansard and make a decision, unless Senator Shoebridge would be prepared to withdraw.
Senator Shoebridge.
As long I'll withdraw it.
Senator Shoebridge, thank you.
So of course the Greens oppose this motion, and it would be useful to see the coalition actually forming a position on this and opposing this motion and speaking against those kind of dangerous fringe elements that they otherwise give a safe home to within their party, because it comes at real cost. And Senator Cox made it clear that one of the communities that pays the cost of these conspiracy theories, one of the communities that pays the highest cost are actually First Nations communities. So reflect on the damage you're causing in these motions. And I'd ask the coalition to reflect on allowing this to continue to happen week in, week out in this place, and reflect on the real cost that's causing on the ground to some of the most vulnerable people in this country, whose job it is, I would have thought, it's our job to protect, not to expose to this conspiracy, the Cooker Conspiracy Club that's pushing this motion forward.
Thank you, Senator Shoebridge. Senator Ruston.
Thank you very much, Madam Acting Deputy President. And can I acknowledge the extraordinary important role that the committees of this place play in making sure that we have got the most robust process that we can to investigate issues that are of importance to all Australians. And I think that the role of the Senate is undermined by the kind of contribution that we just heard from Senator Shoebridge. To be coming in here and being lectured by somebody simply because they have a contrary view to somebody else in this chamber, and somehow suggesting that they're a lesser person and using derogatory terms in which to describe them, I think actually reflects very badly on Senator Shoebridge, more so than those people that have sought to put forward this particular motion. Can I also say to Senator Roberts, who obviously feels very strongly about this particular issue, and others that have made a contribution about the importance they think of shining light on issues that have significant impact on Australia going forward, and particularly our place as we sit in the global environment. So I thank you, Senator Roberts, for bringing forward this important issue. And I believe that as a Senate, we shouldn't be standing in the way of shining scrutiny on very important issues. We are never all going to agree. But the minute we start shying away from having a genuine debate, getting the experts in, which is how the committee process works, then I think that we are letting the Australian public down and not delivering what this particular chamber, I think, has been designed in the first place to do. So, Senator Roberts, the Coalition will be supporting your reference, because that's exactly what it is. It is a reference. It allows us the ability to be able to go into more detail and investigate the very important concerns that have been raised by everybody in this chamber about the particular issue that is the matter of substance of this reference. So I would also put on the record that the Coalition government will never, has never, and will never into the future compromise the interests of Australia or its sovereignty in anything that it does. And we would make sure that we would be very, very strongly of that view right the way through. Because we support transparency. This is something that's really quite interesting when you consider that the platform on which those opposite were elected to this place, they went out to the election and they trumpeted transparency from the hilltops. But I've got to tell you, it is really quite extraordinary that since we have been in this place, there has been nothing that has been less transparent than this Albanese Labor government. We stand for transparency on this side of the chamber, and for that reason that we will be supporting the reference, as we often and almost always support references.
Thank you. Senator Ruston. Senator Canavan.
Madam Acting Deputy President, I support this referral, because we shouldn't be signing an international treaty with the World Health Organization. We should be getting out of the World Health Organization because of their negligent handling of the coronavirus pandemic. It surprises me that very few people have actually raised in this debate the record of the World Health Organization over the past few years. There's a lot of emotion now in light of lockdowns and vaccine mandates and what have you, but people have forgotten the initial stages of the pandemic and the mistakes, the gross errors of judgment that the World Health Organization presided over. And it's absolutely ridiculous that they have, and no one has, been held to account in the WHO for those errors and mistakes, which probably cost hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people their lives. In fact, the head of the WHO is still the same person as at the start of the pandemic, even though at the start of the pandemic, we've all forget now, at the start of the pandemic, the WHO was saying there was nothing to see here. There was no problem. On January the 14th, 2020, the World Health Organization tweeted, and I quote, keep in mind, so January 14th, 2020, we were starting to learn about this thing called coronavirus. We were starting to learn about this thing called COVID-19. Governments, I know our government here in Australia at the time, the Coalition government, were considering border restrictions against travel to and from China. And at that time, at that very moment, when this was quite topical and having to make serious decisions about protecting our own citizens, the WHO tweeted out, January 14th, 2020, preliminary investigations conducted by the Chinese authorities have found no clear evidence of human-to-human transmission of the novel coronavirus identified in Wuhan, China. That's what they said. That's what they said. There was nothing to see here. There was no airborne transmission. There was no human-to-human transmission. You don't need to close your borders. In fact, they doubled down on that, as we were in the weeks to follow discussing a border closure to China. The Australian government was one of the first countries in the world to do that. And I think it's that decision, and almost that decision alone, which prevented a wider COVID spread at that time. We made that decision on January the 29th, 2020, just 2 weeks after that tweet. But as late as February the 3rd, 2020, the WHO, this is a headline from a news article on the February the 3rd, 2020, WHO chief urges countries not to close borders to foreigners from China.
I mean, how has this organisation got any credibility? There's people coming in here saying, we've got to listen to the science, we've got to listen to the WHO. They know it all. Well, if we listened to the WHO in January and February 2020, this country would have had a massive COVID outbreak, because we still would have had flights coming to and from Wuhan. We would have been in the same boat as almost every other country in the world. We were very lucky that for whatever reason, COVID wasn't circulating in a widespread manner here in January and February 2020, probably because we didn't go to those military games in October the year before. Australia and New Zealand were the few countries that didn't go, major countries didn't go to the military games in Wuhan in late 2019. And so we got lucky there, but we would have been very, very unlucky if we had actually listened to the WHO. So for those advocating for saying somehow the WHO is sacrosanct and this oracle of science that must never be disagreed with, can you please explain to me whether or not you would have followed the WHO advice in February 2020? Did you support or agree with the Australian government's very tough and critical decision to close our borders to China at the time? Because if you did agree with that decision, at the time you were going directly against the advice of the WHO. So you can't hold both positions. You can't say the WHO is infallible, but at the same time agree and think that we made the right decisions there in COVID. I mean, their advice goes on. Of course, later on in March 2020, just the next month, WHO says, this reported in CNN, WHO stands by recommendation to not wear masks if you are not sick or not caring for someone who is sick. Do we remember that? Do we remember that? I don't even remember now. It's all gone in the memory hole. But the WHO for months in early 2020, right up really to late 2020, was saying, no need for masks. Don't wear masks. They don't do anything. Now, as it turns out, they'll probably right the first time. Later on, the WHO was saying we all got to wear masks and you've got to force people to do it. But this also shows that there's no such thing as the science. Science evolves, science changes all the time, including in response to something as severe as a pandemic. So it's ridiculous to say somehow an international treaty or an unelected group of health officials should be the gold standard and should effectively run the response to any kind of pandemic. Of course, the WHO were, at first, they weren't in favour of lockdowns or border closures, as per most of the advice, the health advice. We did have coronavirus plans, or we had communicable disease plans in this country and many others, and those plans almost invariably said not to lock down a society in the face of a airborne transmissible disease. But we went and did it, and originally WHO said we shouldn't, and then we did, and then the WHO said we should lock down harder and longer and all the time. And so what happened again to the science here? This last few years was a complete failure of the scientific community. They did not stick to their original plans. They got spooked by the panic of TikTok videos from China with people falling over in the street. We don't know where those videos came from or how they happened, because it never else happened during the coronavirus pandemic. But we got spooked. The scientists got spooked. We all got panicked. I got scared. Everybody got scared. We were all spooked by it. And so the science went out the window, and we all just responded by panic and fear. That's what happened. And this treaty, or allowing a treaty to entrench decision-making into a small group of people who, just like every other human being, are subject to potentially paranoia and fear, is a recipe for more errors during a pandemic. What we need during a response to any kind of crisis like a pandemic is the flexibility and ability of different countries to do different things, and then we can see what works and what doesn't work. And clearly, over the last few years, thank God for the good sense and bravery and courage of the Swedes, because they did chart a different path under huge pressure, under massive pressure. They were called murderers and pandemic spreaders, variant creators, but they have come out trumps. The Swedish experiment has clearly worked better than any other country in the world. They've got pretty much the lowest excess deaths over the last few years of any country in the world, lower than us, even though we were lucky that we closed borders and didn't get COVID. We ended up 3 years later with a higher level of excess deaths than Sweden. So again, those who are saying they support the science, when I learned science at school, I thought the idea was we'd have a hypothesis, we'd experiment, we'd look at what happens in the real world, and then we'd choose the particular experiment or particular course of action which delivered the best outcomes. Well, clearly, over the last few years, the approach of Sweden has delivered much superior outcomes to almost every country in the world. But again, if we entrench the decision-making and power in this group, a particular group of unelected officials who seem completely unaccountable,
that will potentially remove that ability to have that level of experimentation, effectively kill science. There won't be science. It'll just be one particular hypothesis, and you won't be able to compare it or contrast it against other approaches, which was a good thing. Likewise, in the United States, with different states doing different things. Again, clearly, those states who didn't lock down as severely have ended up with much better much better health, and also better economic outcomes, of course, as well. But before I go, I do want to make sure there is some mention of perhaps the greatest failing, almost criminal failing of the World Health Organization in the last few years, with their gross mismanagement of the investigation into the origins of the coronavirus or the COVID-19 pandemic. There was, of course, a lot of controversy at the time that where this had come from. There was a lab in this place called Wuhan that was experimenting on coronaviruses, and then a coronavirus pandemic happens in Wuhan. It seemed reasonable to suggest that perhaps this laboratory that was experimenting on coronaviruses in bats may have played some role. But of course, anyone who suggested that the lab leak theory had any kind of merit was immediately described, like Senator Shoebridge just did then, as a cooker or conspiracy theorist, all this other rubbish. In fact, 27 scientists wrote a letter in the Lancet journal, very respected, or well, until now should be respected journal. They all wrote a letter, these 27 scientists, in March 2020, claiming that anyone who did support or posit the lab leak theory was a conspiracy theorist. That's what the letter said. It was a lab leak theory, was a conspiracy theory. And in that letter, in the Lancet journal, there was as there is in all articles in a medical journal, there was a declaration of interests, and the 27 authors said that, and I quote, "We declare no competing interests." That's what those scientists had said. And so that letter was incredibly influential in effectively giving cover to the Chinese Communist Party and suppressing any discussion, any sensible discussion of whether or not a mistake or otherwise from the Chinese Communist Party played a role. Well, it later came out, so that letter was published in March 2020, and they declared no competing interests. It later came out, and this is a headline from the Daily Mail in September 2021, later came out that 26 of the 27 Lancet scientists who trashed theory that COVID leaked from a Chinese lab have links to Wuhan researchers. Right.
Convenient.
So we have all these, have a senator here today coming in and calling everybody a conspiracy theorist. We had scientists doing the same 3 years ago. Turns out those scientists were directly conflicted and lied about their conflicts of interest, lied about it in a otherwise respected medical journal. Where's the accountability here? Where is the accountability? Why doesn't that get mentioned at all? Why are you running a protection racket for clearly scientists who are, if they're not engaging in criminal activity, it should bloody well be a crime to do something like that. Because as I say, it costs lives. It absolutely costs lives doing stuff like that. What is worse than this, though? What's a scandal enough? How's the WHO fit in here? Well, one of those scientists, one of those 26 scientists, or one of the 27 who signed it, was a guy called Peter Daszak. Peter Daszak was the head of an organisation called the Eco Health Alliance, registered in New York. Eco Health Alliance had funded coronavirus research in bats in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The WHO selected Peter Daszak to play an influential role, to be one of the scientists on the inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus. I mean, how the hell did that happen? This World Health Organization that we're a member of, that we're apparently going to sign a treaty with, where's the accountability? Why aren't we asking questions about this? We fund these guys, spend millions of dollars to the WHO. We asked them, the Australian government specifically asked them to do an inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus. We paid a big price for that in terms of China's unreasonable and illegal trade actions in response to that reasonable request. And then the WHO undermined the government of Australia's position by appointing somebody who had funded work in the Wuhan Institute of Virology to look into the Wuhan Institute of Virology if they had started the coronavirus. That's happened. That happened. And we're just sitting back and taking it. Like, what, don't we have any self-respect? Like, this is the way they're treating us. We're giving them millions of dollars. They get hundreds of millions of dollars from the Chinese government. And they seem to completely whitewash any kind of link to China or whether this came from there. And they're not held to account. The same people are in the same jobs. And that's why I said at the start of this, and it might seem dramatic, but surely we should leave this organisation. If this is their record, if this is their actions and their complete unaccountability here, their complete almost intransigence in seeking to fix any of the errors that they have made, gross errors of judgment that they have made, and almost, and if not criminal negligent activity here in regards to the inquiry they operated, why would we still be involved with them? I think we should have a body that coordinates on pandemics and health responses. Certainly don't think we should need to sign massive treaties or anything with them, but yes, we should have a body where people can come together and discuss these issues. They obviously have cross-border implications when a pandemic occurs, but the WHO is just completely discredited. It's totally stuffed up the coronavirus. And if there is not going to be a complete flush out of the people involved in these stuff-ups, then we should leave it and form some other body. Let's create a new one. We can take our money with other like-minded countries and set up a different body with actual accountability. Because where is the accountability now? If there are other people who won't support this inquiry, which will at least give a degree of accountability on the WHO, maybe we get them into the inquiry and ask them, where's their money being spent? What's happening to it? Why did you get it so wrong? We could ask these questions. If they're not going to support this small inquiry in this Senate into the WHO's gross errors of misjudgment in the last few years, what are they planning to do to hold them to account? Like, where is the accountability? Because any organisation that gets taxpayer-funded money from people hard in this country every day to pay for them, they should be held to account. They should be held to account to parliaments, to elected officials and others. Even if they had done everything right, they should still be held to account. I'd still support this inquiry if they'd done everything right because, sure, we should have an inquiry. There's been a major thing that's gone on in the world and the WHO have been central to it. But they clearly have not got everything right. They clearly made massive errors of judgment. They've clearly, if not been directly involved in a cover-up to the Chinese government, they should have known. They should have known Peter Daszak was doing this stuff. It was clearly and publicly available. He'd spoken about his research on bats in coronavirus in bats in public fora that WHO should have known, and yet they appointed a bloke that was irredeemably conflicted to hold the inquiry into the origins of coronavirus. We should not be funding the WHO. We should be getting out of this corrupt organisation, and we certainly, at the very least, should be doing an investigation into them.
Thank you, Senator Canavan. Senator McKim.
Well, thank you very much, Acting Deputy President. Well, that's 15 minutes of my life that I'm never going to get back. But I did actually learn one thing from Senator Canavan, and that is this: cookers are going to cook. That's what we learned here this evening. Yeah. Now, this is the pandemic that we've been living through for years and we continue to live through today is an extremely serious issue. And as we continue to grapple with the ongoing challenges of this global pandemic, and as large numbers of Australians continue to die of COVID-19, it's critical that we do reflect on the lessons we learned, the mistakes that we've made, the mistakes that we continue to make, and the work that still needs to be done. I want to start by acknowledging the incredible efforts of healthcare workers over the last few years. People who work in the health system, whether they be support workers, doctors, nurses, first responders, all of those other essential workers who do such a terrific and critical job of looking after all of us when accidents befall us or sickness takes us. We need to acknowledge and thank them from the bottom of our hearts, because they have put their own health and safety at significant risk to look after us, to try to keep us safe and to keep our country running. And we owe them a debt of gratitude that can never truly be repaid. We also need to understand and recognise that the pandemic has exposed deep inequalities in our society, particularly in the areas of healthcare, housing and employment. And what the pandemic has revealed ultimately is that we are far more units in an economy than we are human beings to those who govern us. And we've seen that time after time when basic protections for people, such as income support, such as health frameworks, have been removed in order that the economy can keep on trundling along. So we have to address those issues that have been exposed by the pandemic, ripping off some of the band-aids that have covered up some of the gaping chasms in our society, some of the inequalities in our community and in our economy. And we have to commit to addressing those issues and ensuring that everyone has access to the things that they need to stay healthy and to have a good life. We also need to make sure we are prepared for future pandemics, because believe me, colleagues, they will be coming down the line. And that's going to mean investing in public health infrastructure, research of things like vaccines, things like testing for particular viruses, things like ensuring our supply chains are resilient and our emergency and pandemic response plans are up to date. So absolutely, the Australian Greens do support research and review of the ongoing handling of COVID and the lessons that can be learned for the future. And I want to be really clear about something. It really beggars belief that a Labor government isn't working hard to do more to look after people and to create jobs in our society by engaging in a significant retrofitting of public buildings in this country with clean air standards, ensuring adequate ventilation, adequate filtration of our air, and ensuring that new builds in this country comply with rigorous standards. Because one of the most significant things that a government could do in this space at this time is ensure that to the greatest degree possible, the air that we are all and that we rely on to survive as human beings is clean and virus-free. The Greens also support global cooperation in addressing pandemics and public health emergencies, and we believe that the World Health Organization plays a critical role in coordinating international responses to these crises. And we do believe that a global pandemic treaty with a focus on prevention, preparedness and response represents an important step forward in our efforts to protect public health on a global scale. Now, what is always amusing, I'm glad Senator Roberts and Senator Babet are in the chamber. It's always amusing when we just get a little peek behind the curtain of what the cookers and the right-wing conspiracy theorists are actually worried about. Now, Senator Roberts wants to put on his white coat and use the Senate's valuable time and resources to annoy public servants about the Illuminati and Agenda 21, probably the lizard people, and we're not going to have a bar of it. And I have to say, Acting Deputy President, it must be absolutely terrifying.
Senator Roberts.
To please telling the truth instead of the impugning against me, please.
Thank you, Senator Roberts. Senator McKim, if you could not impugn the motives of your fellow senators, that would be much appreciated.
All right, thanks, Acting Deputy President. As I was saying, it must be pretty terrifying being Senator Roberts, because he spends so much time worried about imaginary threats that he can barely come to grips with some of the massive real challenges facing our society. Now, last week, Senator Roberts was in the chamber here carrying on about lab-grown meat. And I was recording while I was listening to him that during last year's election campaign, he defiantly posted on Twitter that he would not, and I quote, shut up and eat the bugs. Well, despite making some jokes about it at the time, I do want to point out to Senator Roberts, through you, Acting Deputy President, that no one is trying to make Senator Roberts eat the bugs. I mean, eat the bugs, don't eat the bugs. The Australian Greens don't care whether you eat the bugs or not, Senator Roberts. But while we're on the subject of irrelevant rants, I would like to thank Senator Babet for dropping into the Senate in between making real estate deals to warn us that we actually don't own DVDs anymore.
Senator McKim, I think to assist the chamber, perhaps you could withdraw that, please, and just because it does reflect upon Senator Babet. And I'd ask you to withdraw it, please.
I withdraw.
Thank you, Senator.
But I do note that Senator Babet did actually say that we don't own DVDs anymore. Well, I want to say Senator Babbitt can speak for himself. He may or may not own any DVDs. I don't know. I've got plenty at home. Senator Babbitt, I just want to say the Lord of the Rings box set on Blu-ray just looks utterly magnificent, and I do commend it to you and to the chamber. But interestingly, Acting Deputy President, as I was coming in here, I found a top secret, a stamped top secret One Nation on the top. And I was very surprised. It's quite dynamite, this document. And when I read it, it turns out that this document is actually a list of proposed Senate inquiries that One Nation are going to push for into the future. And I thought I'd share some of these potential Senate inquiries that One Nation want to pursue. So firstly, on this top secret document, a Senate inquiry into why one sock seems to go missing when you do the laundry. That'll be a critical matter for this chamber to inquire into. A Senate inquiry into whether Elvis is alive and perhaps living in a small village in regional Serbia. A Senate inquiry, this is actually going to stop, this is a barbecue stopper, Acting Deputy President, a Senate inquiry into how they just made maxi bonds smaller but are still charging the same price for them. Senator Roberts, I look forward to that one. A Senate inquiry into how there are like, I'll just read this, how there are like 14 different streaming services, but you still can't find some movies on any of them. That should be an absolute beauty, Senator Roberts. But this one I think is possibly the most of them all, and I do thank Senator Roberts for bringing this one forward, a Senate inquiry into why you need scissors to open a packet of scissors. That one, Acting Deputy President, is an absolute
Senator
ripper,
McKim,
and I look forward.
Senator McKim, my colleague.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. The Senator's reading out a list. I'm wondering if he could table that, please.
Senator McKim, you've been asked to. Would you like to table this?
Well, I thank the senator for the invitation, but I don't think it would be fair of me to table a top secret list of One Nation's proposed Senate inquiries. But the last one on the list, which I think actually the Liberal National senators could be very constructive members of the inquiry into why do you have to have a go to get a go? And I think that one is a critical inquiry in Australian politics. And I just thank One Nation for bringing these just absolutely amazing proposals before the Senate. And as I said at the start of my speech, what we've really found out today is that cookers are actually going to cook, despite what the sensible people in this Senate have got to say. What I want to say in closing, Acting Deputy President, is that the COVID-19 pandemic has, of course, presented us with many challenges, but one of the big opportunities that it has presented us all with is an opportunity to reflect on the state of our society, the state of our government, and the state of our economy. And it has shown us where we need to improve, where we need to invest, the regulatory frameworks that are missing or those that need to be beefed up. And ultimately, it's given us an opportunity to learn a giant lesson about how we need to change as a society and how politics needs to change in this country to make sure that we do more, much more, to look after people and support people who are ill. I want to give a shout out to everyone who's suffering from long COVID in this country. I want to give a shout out and extend my deepest sympathies and those of the Australian Greens to everyone who has lost a loved one, a family member or a friend as a result of COVID-19, because it is cutting a swathe through our community. Life expectancy in this country and globally, and in fact, expectancy is plummeting now at the fastest rate since the Great Famine of China in the early 1950s. That is the rate at which global life expectancy is currently plummeting, and it is due to this virus. It is due to COVID-19 and the global pandemic that we are all living through, and we will live through tragically for some time yet. What we do know is that it has revealed, amongst many other things, the critical importance of public health infrastructure, the critical importance of a robust and responsive healthcare system, the absolutely crucial nature of a coordinated and compassionate approach to protecting everyone in our community, but particularly those who are most vulnerable, the older people, the immunocompromised people. We've also seen the devastating consequences of systemic inequality and economic injustice in this country. We've seen the devastating consequences of a precarious and underpaid workforce and of a lack of investment in the education and training of healthcare professionals. And as we move forward, we have to make sure that we learn the lessons of this pandemic. Invest in our people, invest in public health infrastructure, give more people permanent, secure work with paid sick leave, invest in healthcare workers, and invest in the social safety net that protects the most vulnerable people in our community. I mean, JobSeeker was doubled for a brief and beautiful time during the pandemic by a Liberal National Government, I might add, and my office was flooded with testimonials from people who said for the first time, in some cases in years, they could actually put food on the table and pay the power bill in the same fortnight. And for those who have never laboured under those kind of financial stresses, and I actually have laboured under them for a brief period when I was younger, they are terrible pressures to have to bear on a day-to-day basis, and we should be doing much, much more to ensure that JobSeeker allows people to live a dignified life. We've got to ensure that our economy is resilient and adaptable, and that it provides good jobs and fair wages, and it supports the small businesses and workers who are the lifeblood of our communities. And we've got to do it all with a clear-eyed focus on the challenges and the opportunities that lie ahead. This pandemic has actually demonstrated very clearly that everything is interconnected. We are all interconnected. The jobs people do are interconnected. The pastimes people enjoy are interconnected. Our families, our communities, the economy, our society, the environment, the climate are all interconnected. Our fates are intertwined, and our actions can have far-reaching consequences, not just on ourselves. Together, we have to listen to each other, we have to support each other, we have to love each other, and we have to approach our collective future with hope, with
Question be put. So, just so colleagues are aware that because we're past 6:30, if a division is required, it will be deferred until tomorrow. So the Minister has moved a procedural motion that the question be put. Those of that opinion say aye. Those against say no. So that procedural motion is passed. I will now put the substantive motion, which is the motion moved by Senator Roberts in relation to a reference to the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade References Committee. Those of that opinion say aye. Those against say no. Well, clearly a division is required, and that will be deferred until tomorrow. So now I move